Workforce and Retention webinar series. It's the first one of the series, sponsored by South Carolina Department of Commerce. And today we are featuring the U.S. Department of Labor. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Sonia Barkley, and I am the moderator and the Small Business Outreach Manager for South Carolina Department of Commerce. And before we get started, we're going to go over a few housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded, and all participants should be muted and the cameras off at this time. Use the chat feature to submit any questions that you have throughout the webinar. And also, if there are any questions, they'll be answered at the end. And once everything is over, there will be a brief survey that would go out. It's only 3 questions, 2 yes and no, and 1 where we're asking what's important to you. We ask that you please complete that survey, and once you hit submit, you will receive a thank you and a link to today's webinar for that. So thanks so much for that. Right now, we will hear from Ms. Tammy Green, who is the Business Outreach Program Manager here at Commerce, and she is the manager over both supplier outreach and small business outreach.
So good morning again. I'm Tammy Green, as Sonia mentioned, the Business Outreach Program Manager here at the South Carolina Department of Commerce. The goal of business outreach, again, is to provide business opportunities, of course, that create new relationships and that strengthening those existing ones. We do this by offering access to tools, networking opportunities, referrals to agency partners, and by providing direct customized assistance. So why are we here today? In March of this year, our division surveyed over 2,000 companies we previously provided technical assistance to or touched in some way. We wanted to get feedback on connections that were made to assist those businesses. One question asked was for business owners to identify the 3 most important strategic opportunities or challenges that they were experiencing. Employee recruitment and retention was number 1, followed by market diversification and then technology advancements. So here we are today with the first in a series of monthly webinars that will highlight additional workforce resources and options for our small business owners. Because again, if it's important to you, then it is important to us. In a few minutes, you will hear from Carmen Rodriguez with the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. Carmen will discuss the Fair Labor Standard Act, compliance, violations, overtime, and much more. Thank you again for joining us, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Sonia.
All right, thank you so much, Tammy. Now that she's done the welcome and gave you the overview of what we'll cover today, just want to see the representation of all the industries that's here today. This chart gives you a snapshot of all the industries represented, and it also tells the story of how South Carolina businesses share some of the same needs and concerns when it comes to workforce and retention. Now, your go-to for your staffing needs is still our workforce development team, still SC Do, still SC Works, and all the other SC programs that offer workforce and retention support. This webinar series was designed to introduce other workforce and staffing options that you may not have heard about, and also it was designed to also share any additional information that may be helpful to you when managing your staff and your employees. As Tammy says, today we welcome Ms. Carmen Rodriguez of the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division, who will share some great information. And let me tell you a little bit about Carmen. So Carmen is the Community Outreach and Resource Planning Specialist for the U.S. Department of Labor. She holds a bachelor's degree in communications from the University of the Sacred Heart in Puerto Rico. Her journey at the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division began in 1997 as an investigator in the Tampa District Office. She enforced a variety of acts the Fair Labor Standards Act, the MSPA, which is geared towards agriculture. She's also was heavily involved with the child labor, government contracts, family medical leave, and the H program wage requirements for guest worker visas. Today, she is serving as the Community Outreach and Resource Planning Specialist for the Columbia, South Carolina District Office, where she provides the community with federal labor law training. I present to you Ms. Carmen Rodriguez.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Sonia, and thank you for inviting me. I do appreciate everybody that is here. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to be sharing my screen so that we can begin. I know that you guys will probably have a lot of questions, so maybe you can write them down so you don't forget, and then we can answer those questions at the end. I'm trying here to get my screen, and here it is, and then we can begin. All right. Can you see my screen already? Oh, there it goes. All right. So again, we're going to be talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act is the act that enforces minimum wage, overtime, child labor, and record keeping. And the most important thing about the Fair Labor Standards Act is coverage. We need to discuss who is covered under a law, because not all companies are going to be subject to the provisions of the act. So let's begin with that. There's two types of coverage, and another word that we use for coverage is jurisdiction. The first one is called enterprise coverage, and in a few minutes I'm going to enter into the details of each one. When we cannot assert enterprise coverage, then we look to see if we can assert individual coverage. So the first one is enterprise. So for the enterprise coverage, any company that grosses at least $500,000 a year will be covered under the act. What does that mean is that if the company is grossing at least $500,000, they need to make sure that minimum wage is taken care of, overtime, the child labor provisions, and the record keeping provisions are in place. And for that one also, the company has to have at least 2 employees. Another thing that we have under enterprise coverage is that there are some industries that are named, such as schools and medical, like in nursing homes, or well, not nursing homes, but assisted living facilities are going to be named enterprises. So regardless of what the gross sales are for those businesses, they are going to be covered under an enterprise. Therefore, they need to make sure that they abide by all of the FLSA requirements. For the individual coverage, so one of the things that we ask in all investigations is that we require the employer to provide us with some tax information. It's like the first page of the tax return form. That is the form that is going to show us what is the gross sales of the business. So when we see that it is less than 500,000, then we're going to try to assert individual coverage. And for that, any employee that is engaged in interstate commerce is going to be covered under the law. And individual coverage is on a weekly basis. So if an employee is covered this week and maybe next week, and then for the next 4 weeks they don't do anything that is in interstate commerce, then they lose that coverage. So it's a little bit tricky because they can go in and out of coverage. But when we're out doing investigations, we're going to be asking questions to those employees, and we're going to get like the big picture to see if they are going to be covered or not. So when I mention interstate commerce, what that means is that any employee that perhaps makes phone calls out of state, they mail things out of state, using the internet for the business, for work, is going to make them covered. Anything that crosses state lines, that is when they're going to be engaged in interstate commerce. And it also includes domestic services, so including the home work, yes. Employees of nonprofits may also be covered under individual coverage, regardless of what the amount of money that the nonprofit makes. They can be ordering and receiving goods from out of state. They can be shipping goods out of state, and that is going to make them covered. One thing that I'd like to mention is in the restaurant business. In the restaurant business, a lot of times we have a group of people that are covered and a group of people that are not covered. So servers, for instance, if the server is the one that actually swipes the credit card, it is very possible that the servers will be covered. And the reason why is because the moment that they swipe the credit card, there is a phone call that gets generated, and it usually goes out of state. What we do when we're out is that we're going to get information about that credit card machine. We're going to ask for perhaps a statement for that service, and we will make the phone calls necessary to find out where that phone call goes to in order for us to be able to determine if there is individual coverage for them or not. So the first thing about the FLSA is minimum wage. So any employee that is covered must be paid at least the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage. Right now, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. Those wages can be paid on an hourly basis. They can be paid on a commission basis or on a piece rate basis. Employees can also earn commissions. There's some bonuses that may need to be included in the regular rate to determine if they are being paid at least minimum wage. In the restaurant business, it is very common that the servers or the tipped employees are paid a lower cash wage of $2.13 an hour at least. That's the minimum. And then the employer can take a tip credit to make up the difference between what they're getting paid as a cash wage and the tips to get to minimum wage. One thing that is very, very important, and I know that there's people in the restaurant industry out here today, so I want to make it very clear that all tipped employees are minimum wage employees. All tipped employees are minimum wage employees, regardless of how much they actually make at the end of the week. They could be grossing an average of $15, $20 an hour. They are still considered minimum wage employees. And in a little bit, we're going to be talking about overtime and deductions, and then we'll touch that basis again in just a little bit. Deductions. So one of the reasons that I made that clarification with the tipped employees is because because they are minimum wage employees, if the employer makes any deduction from their pay, for instance, they have to pay for walkouts or for a bill that had some mistakes and they were not able to get charged that entire amount, uniform deductions, all of those deductions are going to make the employee regular rate fall below minimum wage, and then you're going to have a minimum wage violation. So any other deduction, so let's talk about people that are paid a little bit above minimum wage, any deduction that is made from their check, it is very important that employers look at the final week or the pay period that is being paid. They get the gross that the employee gets paid, subtract the deduction, and then divide it into the total hours worked. And if that regular rate is below $7.25 an hour, the deduction cannot be made. It's possible that maybe it needs to be broken down, and instead of making a $30 deduction on week one, they may have to do a $5 deduction and then separate it into the number of weeks until it gets paid. Maybe it's $10 a week until it gets paid. The tipped employees, they receive at least $30 a month in tips. So when we are talking to these employees, we're going to be asking, what is the average amount of money that you make in tips in 1 week or in the pay period, depending on how the employer pays, obviously, but we're going to make sure that at least it's $30 a week, and it's usually met. But the other thing that we're looking at is this employee making good enough tips that they're going to bring them to at least minimum wage? The employer takes a tip credit. Like I had mentioned before, the difference between the cash wage, which usually is $213, the minimum, and the $7.25 an hour, that is a tip credit that the employer takes. And that tip credit, if they're paid at least the $213 is $5.12 an that's going to be paid. Back. Am I back?
Now you
Hello?
are. I was just.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So an employer needs to notify the employee how they're going to be paid. So they need to say, hey, I'm going to pay you a tip credit, a cash wage of $213, and then I'm going to take a tip credit of $5.12, or whichever way. I mean, sometimes employers can pay $5 an hour as a cash wage and have $2.25 as a tip credit. So employees need to be notified of this. And again, when we're doing investigations and we're asking the questions, it is very possible that the employees are going to be asked, did the employer notify you how you were going to be paid? Did the employer notify you that he was taking a tip credit? So it's very important that you keep that in mind and let them know that that they have to, the way that they're going to be paid, so that they can understand it. I mean, a lot of times servers that have been in the industry for a long time, they understand it, but it's important that the employer tells them when they get hired. Okay, and then another thing is that tips are the property of the employee. If an employee is being paid a cash wage lower than minimum wage, all of the tips belong to the employee, and nothing can be deducted from that amount. Therefore, there are some tip pools that are allowed, and that is tip pools with bussers or bartenders, bar backs, but the managers and the owners of a business, of a restaurant, can never take any of those tips from the employees. An employee must be paid for all the hours that they work. In a little while, we're going to talk about record keeping, and I'm going to let you know why I believe that record keeping is the best friend for any employer. But employers have to make sure that employees are paid as worked. And this also includes time that an employee, for instance, if there's a production line going on and a machine is down and 30 minutes, 60 minutes go by and there's no productive work done by the employee is engaged to wait, and it is hours worked. Meal periods and rest periods. So the act does not require an actual meal period. We do enforce that if an employer wants to vary the employee's day of work, it needs to be at least 30 minutes. But any shorter, like 20 minutes or less, the employer cannot make the deduction from the day. So if an employee is required to eat at their desk while they're working, because maybe the phone's going to ring and they need to answer that call, that they cannot make a deduction for meal for that day. They have to be completely relieved of duty in order for them to be able to make the deduction. All right, let's get into overtime. So any covered employee has to be paid at least time and a half of the regular rate for overtime. And that is on a work week basis. Each work week stands alone. Therefore, if you pay on a biweekly pay period, and one employee works 35 hours one week, and then the next week they work 45, you still have a total of 80 hours for the work week for the pay period. However, the 5 hours of overtime on week number 2 are still overtime hours, and they need to be paid at time and a half. Like I mentioned before, each work week stands alone. Every employer has to determine what their work week is. We do see a lot of times that employers pay, but they don't segregate, like, what is my work week? Does it start on Sunday? Does it start on Monday? There are employers that started on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and then it's a 7-day consecutive period. That's the number one thing that all employers need to do, is establish what their work week will be, regardless of how they're going to pay. Even if they're going to be paying, if employers are paying semi-monthly, for instance, which is, it's going to be from the 1st to the 15th, from the 16th through the last day of the month, even though that's the pay period, a work week needs to be established. Here's an example that I wanted to run with you guys about what is a regular rate. There are times that an employer pays an employee on 2 different rates of pay, or they may pay hourly for certain work, and then maybe they get a commission, or they get a bonus, or they get piece rate. So the way that we're going to determine what that regular rate is, in order for us to know at what rate do we pay the overtime, is that you're going to add all of the earnings. So you're going to get all of the earnings from the hourly pay and maybe commission or bonus, and then you divide it by all the hours worked that week, and that's going to give you the regular rate of pay. Here's something that I wish I could be in front of you so that I can see your faces and know if you understand this. But again, if you don't understand this at the end, I'll definitely go over it again. So this is the situation, and you get the regular rate is for all hours worked. So if somebody makes $500 gross and they worked 50 hours, when you divide it, it's $10 an hour, but that is 10 hours for each of the 50 hours. When you're going to calculate the additional overtime, now you're going to calculate the additional half time, because the time was already paid. And so then that regular rate, you divide it by 2, and it'll give you the half time. So in this case, it would be $5 an hour times the 10 hours of overtime, which is an additional $50. And in this pay period, the employee would get a gross amount of $550. Here is another example of how we do it. And actually this slide actually explains the halftime rate. So again, I know that this might be tricky for a lot of people, but remember that when you are doing all of the hours worked, the time is being paid with that first calculation. Therefore, only half is due for the time and a half, okay? All right, there are some things that can be excluded from overtime payment. For the most part, bonuses that are production bonuses, bonuses that an employee is expecting, they will have to be included for overtime purposes. But discretionary bonuses will not have to be included. Discretionary bonuses are bonuses, for instance, that the employer has the complete discretion to make the payment or not, choose the amount or not. If something that the employee is not working towards. So if an employee, for instance, know that if they meet a goal of a certain number for the week or the pay period, they're going to get a bonus, then it's not a discretionary bonus anymore. But if the employer, for instance, a Christmas bonus, that the employer may or may not give it, even though they give it every year, but if one year things are not going well and they decide, you know what, we can't give out bonuses, then that's a discretionary bonus and they don't have to include it. Payments for time not worked. For instance, if an employee is on leave and they get the 8 hours, let's say, for the day, and at the end of the work week, because they had worked some over 8 hours on a particular day, then those 8 hours don't count towards hours worked. So it's hours physically worked that we're going to be looking at. And if the employee is reimbursing an employee for any business expense, for instance, they have to take a test and the employee goes ahead and pays it, but then the employer reimbursed them, that money does not need to be included for overtime purposes. Perks or for the convenience of employees, for instance, let's say that an employee works at a golf club and the employer allows them to have some tea time. That amount of money that the employer it's at their expense, it does not need to be included. If the employer provides profit sharing or any stock options, retirement or insurance plan contribution, none of those monies need to be included for overtime purposes. All right, now we're going to be talking about the exemptions. So we know about minimum wage, we know about overtime, but there are going to be some people that are going to be exempt from those provisions. The first one that I want to talk about is the executive exemption. This is probably the most common exemption. This is the one where managers, supervisors may fall. It is important to say that titles do not make exemptions. Anybody can be called a director, anybody can be called a manager, but the fact that that's the title that they were given does not mean that they're going to be exempt from overtime. A very big misconception as well is that sometimes employers think that if they pay a salary, it means that they don't have to pay overtime, but that's incorrect. In this case, we're going to have salaried exempt employees and salaried non-exempt employees. So the executive exemption, for this exemption, there's a few things that we're going to be looking at. The first one is, how many people does the person supervise? They need to supervise at least 2 full-time employees or its equivalent. So they can have 1 full-time, 2 part-time, or 4 part-time people under them, and that's the first test that we're going to look at. The second thing is that they have to have the authority to hire and fire, or at least make recommendation. If they're not the one that is going to have the final decision and actually going to that person and say, you are being terminated, they have to at least have recommendation. That means that they can go to their superior and say, hey, so-and-so is not working out. He's been making a lot of mistakes. I've been talking to him or her about it, and we had another mistake today. And then the superior decides, okay, then yes, then I think it's time and we should terminate. Then his input was used for the termination, and the same goes with hiring. Sometimes they're sitting in an interview and the manager can say, you know what, I don't think that this person will be a good fit for us, or I think this person would bring a lot of good assets to the company, and I think it's a team player, and I think he's gonna mesh with everybody here. Then they're recommending for hiring, and they can the exemption may be applicable. Another thing is that supervision must be their primary duty. So they have to be hired to be a supervisor. They cannot be like team leads, most likely if they're working side by side doing the same thing as everybody else, but they're kind of like the lead. That does not mean that they're supervisors. They were not hired to be supervisors. They were hired to do the work just like everybody else, but then they were just given an additional responsibility of just being a lead. So supervision, managerial decisions, and responsibilities must be their primary duty. And the last thing, and the most important one, because a lot of times we see a lot of problems with this part, is that the salary must be at least $684 a week. This amount went up in 2020. It used to be $455 a week, and now it's $684 a week. So in order for an exemption to be applicable, all of those need to be in place. The second exemption we're going to be talking about is the administrative exemption. This one might be a little bit harder. This one is the employee must be able to make decisions for the company, decisions that perhaps will affect the policies of the company. They may be able to change policy. They have to have discretion and independent judgment in matters of significant importance for the company. So a lot of these activities may include like making analysis and determinations, setting prices, things that may take risk for the company. When we're doing investigations and we're trying to assert this exemption, we're going to be asking if they have to run things by somebody else. Do they have the discretion to say, let's say that we're going to be spending $10,000 or $1 million, or is there a limit to how much they can really do for the company without having to ask somebody else for their input before they can actually make the determination? Another exemption is the professional exemption. For the professional exemption, the performance of the work will require advanced knowledge in the field of science or learning, and it is usually a 4-year degree at least. So when we're doing the interviews, we're going to be asking the employees if they have a degree. And then we're going to look at, okay, what type of work are they doing? And we want to make sure that the degree has to do with what they are actually working. Another exemption for the professional exemption that does apply is those people that do performance requiring invention, imagination, or originality. I'll give you the example of a graphic artist. When we're looking at a graphic artist, for example, we are going to be asking, are you creating these, whatever it is, logos or whatever, from your own imagination, or are you going to a software where there's going to be different things that you can select and then use it, do it that way? So again, they need to be able to create, to have invention and using their imagination in order for this to be applicable. Let's talk about common violations under overtime. So the first common violation is that regular rate. It's the failure to include bonuses, shift differentials, or anything like that when calculating the overtime. And I would say that the most violations is on bonuses and commissions. Employers believe that okay, this person gets $15 an hour and I'm going to pay all the $15 an hour and pay the overtime based on the $15 an hour, but then forget that all bonuses and commissions need to be included for that regular rate in order for them to compute the overtime. Combining hours, for instance, if an employer has 2 establishments and an employee works part of the week in one establishment and the rest of the week in a second establishment, they do not combine the hours for the whole week. So it's important that even if you have separate payrolls for each establishment, that if an employee is working in both, that you combine the hours. Or for instance, if an employee has dual rates, so they get paid $10 an hour to do X job, but then when they do the other job, they're going to be paid $12 an hour, then you have to combine all of those, that you have to do the total hours worked, get the regular rate in order to determine what the overtime rate will be. And then of course, in the tipped employees, the biggest issue that we find is the failure to calculate the correct overtime rate. So if you're in the restaurant business and are not familiar with this, this might throw you off. And again, I'll be happy to explain it more later, but this is hopefully, and again, I wish I was able to look at your faces, because then I would know if you understand it or not. But minimum wage is their regular rate. So you're going to do minimum wage times time and a half, which is 1088, and then you're going to subtract the tip credit that you take to determine what the overtime rate will be. Okay, so minimum wage times 1.5 minus the tip credit gives you the regular rate or the overtime rate for a tipped employee. Another common violation is that employers say that employees are exempt from overtime, but when we're doing the interviews and we're asking the questions, we realize that they're non-exempt employees. We have a lot of times deductions that are in overtime work weeks that will cause an overtime violation. Misclassification is another very big common violation that we have. A lot of times we find people employers that say that their employees are independent contractors and they're not keeping track of their hours. They're not paying the overtime after 40 hours. They just pay a set amount and that's it. Not being paid for all hours worked is another common violation. And then confusion between state and federal law. So for the rule of thumb is that whichever law is stricter is the one that we're going to enforce. All right, so we have minimum wage and overtime and exemptions taken care of. Let's talk a little bit about child labor. I must say that today, because of the pandemic, we have noticed a lot of child labor violations because a lot of kids are willing to work and they have more time because perhaps during the school year they were doing it from home and they have a little bit more time. And that's great that minors are wanting to work and learn and build those skills. But there are some restrictions. So I'm going to start with the 14 and 15-year-olds. 14 and 15-year-olds can be legally employed. However, they can only work outside school hours. And when school is in session, they can only work from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So they cannot work past 7 p.m. However, starting June 1st until Labor Day, which is typically the summer vacation for them, that the hours are extended to 9 p.m. They can work 3 hours a day when school is in session, 18 hours a week when school is in session. When school is not in session, they can go ahead and work up to 40 hours a week. And the other thing that is very important is that there are some restrictions on hazardous occupation that will cover all of our minors. So any minor from the age of 14 to age 17 needs to be employed within the requirements where they're not going to be doing any hazardous occupations. I'll give you some examples. Roofing and construction, driving, they cannot drive even though they have a driver's license, they cannot drive. There are some limitations. For instance, if they're driving perhaps a golf cart and it is not in public roads, then that will be okay. But the moment that they have to cross a public road where cars are going to be driving through, they cannot drive that anymore. In restaurants, we have meat slicers that they cannot use. They cannot even clean the meat slicers. There's paper balers or those compactors. All of those occupations, no minor is going to be able to do it. There's actually 17 what we call hazardous occupations where that minors cannot do. Record keeping. A few minutes ago, I said that record keeping is that records are going to be your best friends. So one thing that I've always told employers is that sometimes employers have employees that they feel very comfortable with, and then they decide, you know what, we're not going to be keeping track of the hours that you work. We know when you're here. We know when you're working. We know that you're reliable, and they fail to keep track of the hours worked. So one day, this employee may be doing something completely wrong and you have no other choice than terminate them. And you terminate, and then they're going to call us and say, you know what, this employer never paid me overtime. I used to work at least 50 hours a week, every single week, and I was not paid for overtime. I was not even paid for the whole 50 hours. They paid me only for 40. And when we come out to do the investigation, we're going to ask for the records. And if the employer doesn't have the records, then we're actually going to go with what the employee is saying, because record keeping is a requirement of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So that's why I say that records are your best friends. You can choose any method that you want to use. It can be a time clock. It can be a timesheet. It can be a calendar where employees actually have their schedule, but then at the end, if they make any changes to that schedule, if it gets corrected, then we can use that as record keeping for time records. So what I do recommend is that any changes, maybe that the employees can sign recognizing that they made the change. Excuse me, my throat was getting dry. So you can choose whichever way, as long as it's accurate. That's what we're going to be looking for. When we go out and we look at a time cards or timesheets, written timesheets, and we see 8 to 5, 8 to 5, 8 to 5, 8 to 5, 8 to 5 for weeks and weeks at a time, that raises a red flag, because nobody actually works 8 to 5 every single day. One day it could be 8:05 or 8:10, and they work until 5:05 or 5:10, 5:15. So there should be as accurate as possible. Other records that the employers need to keep is the record of the employees' demographics, their full name, the sex, the date of birth if they're younger than 19, the regular rate that they're going to be paid. We're going to be looking at payroll records, and we need to see that they have the total hours worked, the straight time earnings, the overtime earnings, any deductions that are made. All of those need to be kept. So on the record keeping, we actually have 3 things. The last thing is the posting. So we have time records, we have payroll records, and then we have posting. All employers that are covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act must have the minimum wage poster. Okay, even if you live in a state where the minimum wage might be higher for that state, still the federal minimum wage poster must be posted. Those are free. Nowadays, you can request it. You can actually download an electronic one, and the site for that is listed here. Or you can call us, and we can provide you with a form or a poster. We can mail it to you. So it's important that you have those available. Our statute of limitations is 2 years. When we go out to do an investigation, we typically go back 2 years. Sometimes we can go back 3 years if we find, for instance, that the employer is falsifying records, or if it's a second or third investigation and we're finding that the violation is willful, we may go back 3 years, but for the most part, we're going to go back 2 years. And for those 2 years, we're going to look at time records, payroll records, talk to employees that worked within those 2 years, and make our determination that way. When we find that there are violations and there's back wages due, it is a voluntary agreement to pay the back wages. However, if the employer fails to agree to pay the back wages, we may consult our own attorneys and ask if they want to take the case and perhaps sue the employer for the back wages. And also, all employees always have their private action, and they can actually sue the employer if the employer does not pay the back wages. Here are some things that we do not require. The Fair Labor Standards Act does not require vacation pay, holiday pay, sick pay, rest breaks, like I have mentioned before. We don't require the rest breaks, but if you're going to take a deduction for the rest break, it needs to be at least 30 minutes. Premium pay for weekend or holiday work, limits a number of hours or days the employee 16 years or older may work. Pay raises, employers are not required to have pay raises or have any policy on that. Penalties. So when we do an investigation, if it's a first-time investigation, it is very possible that penalties will not be assessed. However, I said possible because there is always a possibility that they could. It depends on all the circumstances. If we find that the violation was willful, then we may have to assess those civil money penalties. Another thing that we have been assessing is liquidated damages. And actually right now we are doing 100% of liquidated damages. So if an employer, we find violations and the employer owes $2,000 in back wages, then it's going to be double. It's going to be $4,000. So if an employee is due 100, they're going to be due 200. So that those are things that you need to keep in mind, that even though when we ask for you to pay the back wages, we're just asking for restitution for what you should have paid from the beginning. Now, in additional to that, where you may have penalties and you may have liquidated damages. We have a lot of compliance assistance. We have a lot of information on our website. There is the web page on the bottom, dol.gov agencies WHD, which is Wage and Hour Division. That has a lot of information, but we also have two other websites that you guys can visit. One is employer.gov, employer.gov. And then if you'd like to give information to employees and have them look up information, there's worker.gov. And that those two websites give you a lot of information on the laws. You can look at fact sheets and regulations and get a lot of information on that. Here is the toll-free number to call us, 866-487-9243. This will go to a technician that is answering the calls, and then we'll direct it to the proper office. There are at least 200 offices throughout the nation, and we will be able to get you to the right office. Another website is the e-laws, and this is a very good one for small businesses. It has a lot of interactive ways to, for instance, calculating the overtime. If an employee gets paid on an hourly basis and gets a bonus, it'll help you calculate the overtime. And this is the end of my presentation. I am hoping that you guys have a lot of questions, and we can get to answer them.
Yes, Carmen, we have a few questions. Veronica, she asked, what about deductions for health, dental, FSA, 401k, etc., that could drop the employee below minimum wage?
Those are for the benefit of the employee. So those are exclusions from that, from the overtime. You don't have to worry about those because it's for the benefit of the employee.
All righty, thank you. Thank you for the question, Veronica. She had another one too. Hold on one second. Can hours worked be sent to the employee's manager via an email and meet the record keeping requirement?
Yes. Employers can choose any way of keeping track of the hours worked. So if that is the way, I mean, the only downside that I'm going to see for that is that if it's a larger company, you're going to have a lot of documents to produce if you go through an investigation. But as long as you keep them, because you have to keep those records for at least 2 years. So if there is a way of maybe putting them in a folder, and that way you have a folder, and right now I just had the idea that if you have a folder with each employee's name, and then you just put those emails in their folder, then you're going to be easily, you can go back and say, okay, well, let me just open their folder and here's all of their time records.
Great, thank you. And lastly, we have a question from Mike, and he wants to know, is there a listing somewhere of the hazardous jobs limited for youth employment?
There is, and you know what I would be happy to do, Sonia, is provide you with some information on that so that you can perhaps disperse it through everybody that is here with us today.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much. And Louise has a question. If an employee only wants to take 20 minutes of their lunch break, I guess, what are the repercussions or anything from that?
Yes. If the employee chooses that they don't want to do their 30-minute lunch, the employer is going to be held responsible if the employer is only deducting 20 minutes for lunch. So in that case, employers should be able to should go back to the employees and tell them, look, this is our policy. we are going to deduct 30 minutes from your day. However, you have to take your 30 minutes and be uninterrupted for 30 minutes. So if they choose to take 20 minutes, the employer can, of course, go to them and discipline them for not following the policy.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so Veronica just needed, I guess, some clarity as far as the amount of time the records should be kept. She's
2
like, thank
years.
you. I thought time records needed to be maintained for 3 years, but you stated 2 years. So it's definitely 2 years, right?
There's some records that need to be 3 and some need to be 2. But those time and payroll records need to be kept. You know what? I always tell employers, because one is 3, one is 4, it's 2. Just keep all of the time and payroll together for 3 years. It's going to be the best practice.
Okay, great. Heidi has a question as well. Instead of deducting uniforms, et cetera, from hourly employees' paycheck, could you ask them to pay directly out of pocket for those items?
Let's take a restaurant, for example. Because a restaurant, the tipped employees are minimum wage employees. If they pay for it in cash, it is still a violation, because when we are out doing an investigation, we're going to ask those questions. And the moment that they say, well, it wasn't deducted from my check, but I had to pay $20 for them, then we're going to take that as, if everybody's saying the same thing, then we're going to ask for that to be paid back. So if it's an employee that makes more than $7.25 an hour and a deduction is made, then we're going to be asking the questions, and then we'll do the math. So if it's somebody that gets paid $15 an hour and they had to pay $30 on 1 week, then we'll do the math to see if the minimum wage was violated or not.
Thank you. Cecilia, she has a question. Do time records need to be kept for salaried exempt or just hourly and salaried non-exempt?
That is correct.
Which one?
When employees are salaried exempt, because they're exempt, you don't have to keep track of their hours anymore. But those salaried non-exempt and hourly employees, you do have to keep track of their hours.
Great. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Oh, here's Veronica. You stated in the presentation slides will be available. Will the recording be available too? Yeah, I would like to share this with our payroll practitioners. Definitely, Veronica. At the end, at the very beginning, I did mention that there's going to be a very brief survey. It's just 2 yes or no questions that'll be asked, along with something that may be important to you, a topic you would like to see in the future. And once you hit submit, your reply will include the link to the webinar where you will have access to the slides as well.
Yes, and I can also send the slides in a PDF form,
Okay,
so that
great.
you can have those as well.
Thank you so much. Well, if there are no other questions, thanks so much for your comment, Veronica. This was a great presentation. I do appreciate Carmen stopping by to share all this great information with us. And on behalf of Commerce and today's attendees, Carmen, we thank you for joining us today and for sharing and presenting this great information. And I'm sure our attendees learned something new today and can use this information in the future. We thank you so much for joining us. For everyone that's online, thanks. Everyone that's online, we have a part 2 to the webinar series, and it's will be presented by Commerce, and it will be from our Workforce and Development team, and that will be on July 21st. I'm going to see if we can share that slide with you right now. I'm going to ask you to hold on for 1 second. And while that's coming up, we do have a place on Commerce's website where you can look at all the events that are out there, and you will see this webinar series. As stated before, it will be held monthly. It'll be once a month, where we'll present to you some type of workforce and retention type of information, a type of workshop, a type of webinar. And if not, then we will certainly have something to you to educate you, it's like we did today when it comes down to overtime and all of the other information that Carmen shared. On behalf of the businesses outreach team, which consists of me, myself, for the small business, and Dayton Ward for our supplier outreach program manager, we do thank you all for joining us today. So that concludes our webinar. We certainly enjoyed everyone, and we will send the slides and all the additional information out to you right at the end. Thank you so much, and thank you again, Carmen, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you
All
very
right.
much. Have a great day,
All right.
everybody.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.